A car is not a luxury, but a means of transportation. This famous quote from Ostap Bender, one of the Soviet Union's most beloved literary characters, resonated throughout the nation. Yet ironically, hardly anyone could embrace this sentiment, as owning a car was the very definition of luxury in those days. The mere act of navigating the evening streets behind the wheel of your own vehicle could fill you with a profound sense of accomplishment, as if you'd reached the pinnacle of success. And if you were fortunate enough to possess this particular model, the admiring glances of passers-by would elevate you to an almost mythical status in their eyes. My name is Julie, and you're watching Soviet Born, a channel where we tell you the whole truth about the Soviet Union that no one else will tell you. So stay with us, it's going to be very interesting. A car was genuinely a luxury item. You couldn't simply purchase one, as there were no dealerships in the Soviet Union. The state maintained complete control over all vehicle sales. Only truly prominent figures could acquire them at will. Cosmonauts, actors, celebrated directors, academics, and naturally, athletes. The right to purchase a car without queuing was granted solely for exceptional achievements. Yes, there was also the possibility of winning one in a lottery, though I've never heard of any actual cases. Party members and winners of socialist labor competitions were also privileged with car buying rights. But if you were an ordinary citizen with the desire to own a car, you had to join a queue, submit an application, and receive your number, along with an estimated timeline for acquisition. To put this in perspective, if you joined the queue in 1970, your turn might not come until 74 or 75. So simply waiting in line was practically an exercise in futility. Yes, purchasing a used car was an option, but even the used car market wasn't straightforward. There was a widespread understanding. If you were fortunate enough to buy a new car, after driving it for several years, 2, 3, or 4, you could sell it for significantly more than what you paid initially. The spare parts store managed the sale of new cars, along with motorcycles, mopeds, and handled used car transactions. And I, your Julie, actually worked in this establishment. You see, I spent many years in Soviet trade, and by profession I'm a commodity specialist, or in contemporary terms I suppose you'd call it a senior manager. Yes, if we're translating the role. My career in Soviet trade began at the ground level as a simple cashier, a sales cashier. These spare parts stores were among my first jobs. Like many others, I worked while pursuing my education, studying by correspondence for one of the most sought-after qualifications in the Soviet Union, commodity specialist in non-food items. When I was very young, my mother's uncle acquired a Moskvich 412. I remember this car from my earliest childhood. We would take trips to the forest in it, use it for visiting people. And throughout my memories of my uncle, that car was a constant presence. Naturally, in Soviet times, everything was in short supply. Not only did you have a car, it would constantly need repairs, you had to source spare parts, and they were rarely available in sufficient quantities. And of course, once again, all parts went through our auto parts store. I had already begun working when our relative made his first request. Please get me a muffler. This turned into quite an interesting story because he was such a distinguished person, quite heavy-set, such a high-ranking official, a party member. I remember calling him at work and saying, "Please come, I've got you a muffler." And this serious, somber man, not through the main entrance, but through the store's back door. I quietly opened the door for him. He gave me the money, naturally, for this muffler. I brought out this muffler for him, and I remember his happy face. This grown man, when he gleefully hoisted this muffler and, taking small steps, carried it to his car. There were many such cases, because I think many women whose husbands were car owners could say with 100% certainty that for them, the car was in some cases a competitor, because such tender words, such kind treatment, and such great amounts of time a man would only give to his car. If there was a car in the family, men would disappear into their garages. For Soviet men, a car represented an entire universe, because garages, which weren't located at homes, but in separate garage communities where securing a spot was itself a challenge. And generally, men would congregate in these garages. It was a whole ritual, as they would gather there on weekends, talk, socialize, discuss. And for most wives on Saturday, Sunday, they didn't even need to ask about their husband's whereabouts. Naturally, they would say he was in the garage. The Gaz-21 Volga, the queen of Soviet roads, was the most coveted automobile of the 70s and 80s. Acquiring this car was nearly impossible. Technically, an ordinary person could buy it. I know this well, having worked directly at the auto parts store where used car sales were processed. What did the processing look like? The seller and buyer would arrive, bring the car, and call for a commodity specialist. The specialist would go out and appraise the car. And it couldn't be sold and processed for a price higher than the car's original value. The commodity specialist would process and evaluate the car. After this, people were sent to me. I would calculate the cost, prepare the documents, and collect the commission fee. The state tax for car sales was 7%. Well, I would collect these 7%, and the buyer and seller would settle up in my presence. And it was clear that one price would be officially recorded for the car, while in reality, it was sometimes sold for up to twice as much. That was a completely different dark scheme, which we won't focus on today. If you're interested in how this worked, write to me in the comments, and I'll tell you. When I started working at the auto parts store, I was only 18 years old. Naturally, I didn't have enough money to buy such a car for myself, but I certainly had the opportunity to help acquire one for my father, whether a new car or a used one. My mother was categorically against acquiring a car. She justified this by saying that in her youth she had been in an accident, and because of this, she had a certain fear about a car appearing in our home. I remember this case. 4 Niva cars arrived at our store. Of course, again, these were scarce items. They went through certain acquaintances. And the senior commodity specialist approached me and said if I wanted, I could take one of these cars. Moreover, as a store employee, I could acquire it on a 2-year interest-free credit. which in the Soviet Union was just incredible luck. And of course, I ran to call my father and mother to tell them that I had such an opportunity to acquire, they had just appeared then, this Niva car. It was very expensive and quite prestigious. This was the first SUV in the Soviet Union, to which my father said, "Yes, of course, I want this car," as he'd always dreamed of taking up fishing and hunting in his later years. But my mother was once again absolutely against it, which deeply disappointed me. I can only imagine how my father felt. I believe as a woman, she harbored specific concerns about my father, because a man with a car, his social status was considerably high. If the car was prestigious, then a man who owned it became highly attractive to most women. I suspect my mother simply worried greatly about my father, afraid that someone might notice him in such a beautiful car and threaten our family harmony. That was my personal family story. Though again, I'll mention, our family friends owned both motorcycles and cars. We'd all traveled to the countryside in their vehicles without issue. Somehow my mother wasn't afraid to ride in others' cars then. One of my most vivid car-related memories is connected to this car, the Volga. My father was a highly qualified specialist in his field, and his direct supervisor, a very prominent figure in our city, I remember his surname was Pavlovsky, drove exactly this model. I remember once when he came to pick up my father, they needed to drop me off somewhere along the way. And he said, "No problem, put your child in the car, we'll drop her off," meaning me, "and then we'll proceed with our business." And I remember, not only would everyone in the courtyard, residents, grandmothers, children, gather to see who such a car was visiting when it arrived, but my father would proudly enter such a vehicle. And imagine, I, a small girl, got to ride in such a car. My father sat in front with this Pavlovsky, while I sat in this luxurious automobile. For me, that massive back seat, which isn't here now, felt as spacious as a one-room apartment. Though I had never been on a steamship then, I had this sensation as if we were sailing on some grand vessel, in such a tall, enormous car. Now, naturally, it looks rather modest, like a standard car, but back then it was something truly massive, genuinely huge. And I remember riding in this car with such delight, gazing out the window like this, with sunlight streaming in my eyes, and I had this feeling that I was absolutely a queen, a true queen. And I derived maximum pleasure from riding in such a car. And now, when I see this car, I naturally think of my father first, and then about that childhood impression, when I first rode in such a luxurious car for those times. Next to the auto parts store stood a large grocery store. Naturally, we all knew one another, we all interacted. As I mentioned, we had a unified trade system then, we all worked within the state system. One day, the senior sales clerk from the grocery store approaches me and says, "I'm in a situation. I'm currently going through a divorce." You see, her husband had, well, I won't repeat the unfavorable words she used about him, but let's just say he started playing the field and decided to leave her for another woman. And she says, I need to ask you for a significant favor. We have a Zaporozhets car. Whatever kind of car it might be, it's still a car, she tells me. Essentially, her husband had told her, I'm leaving you everything. The only things I'm taking from home are my beloved car and the garage. She says, no, that's not happening. You're not taking this car. We'll divide everything equally. And I must tell you something else. When we processed used cars for sale, we naturally followed state standards. We had these massive albums detailing every car part and their costs. When a commodity specialist assessed a car's residual value, they used these enormous catalogs. We had a catalog for practically every Soviet car model. These were incredibly comprehensive volumes, as I mentioned. So, she tells me, please evaluate this car completely, every single part, because I want to literally divide this car with him. She intended to disassemble it, determine its total value, take it apart, and split these components with him. Essentially, as you can understand, not just metaphorically saw it in half, but actually dismantle it and divide the parts. And the commodity specialist looked at me, sighed and said, well, all right, took it and said, we'll manage this ourselves, deciding to undertake the evaluation and division of this car personally. That was our amusing yet deeply sad story. When I was trying to convince her not to do this, and asked her, please, tell me, why divide the car? And then I was convinced once again of just how prestigious and important car ownership was in the Soviet Union. Because she literally told me, I'm not taking it apart because it's not needed, it is needed, but I'll do everything to ensure he doesn't have the slightest possibility to drive that. Well, the mildest word she used was prostitute in this car. This has been our discussion about cars in the Soviet Union. Or more precisely, not about cars themselves, but about the desire to own one, about their prestige in Soviet society. Certainly, if you're interested, I can share many more stories, especially those directly connected to my work. So write to me, I'll be delighted to read your comments, to learn what you'd like to see on our channel. Subscribe, support us. This was Julie, Soviet-born channel.
До новых встреч!
And this happened to a fella, and this is their story that they tell, this joke. That this man, he laid down his money, and then the fella that was in charge said to him, okay, come back in 10 years and get your car. And he said, morning or afternoon? And the fellow behind the counter said, well, 10 years from now, what difference does it make? And he said, well, the plumber's coming in the morning.